Hello, everyone. Welcome to Community Bookstore's virtual event series. My name is Noah Mintz. I'm the store's event coordinator, and Community Bookstore is celebrating over 50 years in business, and we credit the continued support of readers and writers for this milestone. Thank you all for spending the evening with us. Since the ruling of Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization was announced last month, overruling Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood v. Casey, I think I can safely say that everyone in our community has been outraged and reeling, even if it didn't come as a shock. And looking for answers both to how we got here and what we can do next to win back the basic human right to safe and legal abortions. Tonight, it's my sincere privilege to welcome two women who have long been involved in the struggle to protect abortion rights and reproductive freedom. Mary Ziegler, whose new book, Dollars for Life, was just published by Yale University Press, and Julie F.K., whom we also hosted last year when her book, Controlling Women, was published. But first, just some housekeeping before I introduce our guests properly. We've enabled Zoom's auto-transcribe setting, so if your version of Zoom is up to date, hit the live transcription button at the bottom of your screen to enable closed captions. Sorry, it was not, and now it is enabled. If you have any questions for tonight's guests, please click on the Q&A button, which is also at the bottom of your screen, to submit them. We will be asking those at the end of the program, so please don't be shy. There's also a chat box to which I'll be posting a link to buy tonight's book if you haven't already, and I'll be posting some links to abortion funds and other organizations to which you may wish to contribute as well. One caveat for tonight is that we're all at the mercy of our home internet connections, so please bear with any technical issues that could arise, and we'll try to resolve them quickly. And we have some really exciting virtual events coming up for you this summer, so head to our website, communitybookstore.net, and sign up for our newsletter to stay up to date. So now a little about tonight's guests, and we'll get started. Mary Ziegler is the Daniel P.S. Paul Visiting Professor of Constitutional Law at Harvard Law School. She will join the UC Davis School of Law faculty this fall. One of the world's leading historians of the abortion debate in the United States, she is the author of 4 books on social movement struggles around abortion, including the award-winning After Roe, The Lost History of the Abortion Debate, which was published by Harvard University Press in 2015, and Abortion and the Law in America, Roe v. Wade to the Present, Cambridge University Press in 2020. Her new book, Dollars for Life, The Anti-Abortion Movement and the Fall of the Republican Establishment, was published by Yale in June and received positive reviews from Kirkus, the New York Times, and Publishers Weekly. If you've been listening to NPR in the past few weeks, like me, you've also likely heard her discussing the book there. She often contributes to leading media outlets around the world, including ABC, The Atlantic, BBC, CBS, CNN, MSNBC, The New York Times, NPR, PBS NewsHour, and The Washington Post. And Julie F.K. is well known as a litigator and voice advocating for reproductive freedom worldwide. She combines legal expertise with personal narratives to bring an understanding of the legal issues and the pressing need for activism that is inclusive and human rights based. Kay is the attorney who designed and litigated the landmark abortion rights case ABC versus Ireland before the European Court of Human Rights. Her newest book, Controlling Women, What We Must Do to Save Reproductive Freedom, co-authored with Catherine Colbert, proposes new strategies inspired by medical advances, state-level protections, and human rights activists in the US and globally. So now without any further ado, I will hand it off to you, Mary. Julie, thank you both so much for doing this with us this evening.
Thank you, Noah, and I am delighted to be here in the virtual space with my favorite brick and mortar independent bookstore of Community Books in my local Brooklyn, and to welcome Mary Ziegler, a colleague and friend, and the kind of law professor who makes you want to go to law school or even go back to law school if you've already been. I learned a lot from your book. I was saying when we were talking a little bit earlier that I always tell people vote, 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 and wonder why we haven't been winning more. I think your book explains that so well, of the connection between campaign finance and the kind of deal making between the anti-abortion movement and the Republican establishment. And I look forward to being in conversation and unpacking some of that, as well as, I think, talking about how we move forward. I mean, these are some pretty dark days that I'm not sure any of us expected. So with that, I'd love to kick it off, and maybe you could say a couple of sentences about where we are now. I think a lot of people know, probably most people have been inundated to the point of depression, but if you could kind of give an overview of the lay of the land since Dobbs dropped, so to speak.
Sure. So, I mean, obviously Dobbs overruled Roe v. Wade. That's a good starting point, and kind of unleashed a period of really uncertainty, unlike anything I've seen. So I think it's fair to say that if the court had overruled Roe in 1992, there would be less uncertainty than there is now. The world that kind of Dobbs came into is one in which the anti-abortion movement is more fragmented, right? So what states are going to do in terms of banning abortion, whom they're going to punish, the extent to which they're going to regulate interstate conduct, is more of anybody's guess, because there are a lot of different organizations jockeying for position, which adds additional uncertainty to, pharmacists prescribing drugs, including drugs that aren't even intended for people seeking abortions, to people who are pregnant, who are seeking care, to doctors who are unsure of how to provide that care, to lawyers unsure, lawyers, for example, for corporations who are trying to figure out whether and to what extent they can reimburse travel for people who are seeking to go out of state to get abortions without facing criminal charges, right? So these are questions that we have no real precedent for. I mean, if you'll hear a lot of people like me probably on the radio saying we don't know, or it's not clear, or we're not sure. So this is a period in which obviously we know this right has been taken away, but exactly how states are going to react and what that's going to mean, other than that it will probably be, in some ways better and in some ways worse than what we saw before Roe. We just have a period, I think, of unprecedented uncertainty as well.
Yeah, I think unprecedented has been a word that's been traveling with us through the pandemic and through the Trump era and other ways. And one thing that we do know is that when abortion is made illegal, it doesn't go away, it goes underground. And I like you, am concerned about the chaos as a lawyer and as a human being of how do we get people and how do we get women to services when so many people are being chilled from helping them because of this legal uncertainty. So let's talk a little bit about how we got here, because it doesn't sound very accidental when you read your book. And I'm going to go back and forth between calling them the anti-abortion movement and the pro-life movement. I think everybody has the right to kind of name themselves, but it sticks in my throat a little bit to call them the pro-life movement. So I'll switch back and forth, but you talk in your book about how sort of many people really portray Trump as an unprecedented disruptor, but you note that his upending of US politics was actually decades in the making. Can you walk us through kind of how the old guard Republican establishment lost power and how Republicans now become the party of conservative Christianity and the anti-abortion movement? And sort of what was the role that campaign finance played in this transformation?
Yeah, so this book started, I think, in part because, well, I mean, in two ways. One, because I've always been a historian of the abortion debate, as Noah was saying, and I kept seeing all of this extensive involvement with campaign finance. That was weird to me at first, right? Because if you think about who usually has the most to gain for more money in politics, it's the people with the most money, right? I mean, you would think of the Koch brothers, you would think of Americans for Prosperity. And so I didn't really know what these organizations were doing. And then the more I researched it and the more I wrote, the more I began to see that the story of sort of how we got here is not just a story about how rules on abortion changed or attitudes about abortion changed or arguments about abortion changed, although that's certainly part of it. It was also a story about how our kind of how our democracy has changed, right? How the Republican Party is sort of unrecognizable from what we would have known in previous decades, how the Supreme Court in many ways is unrecognizable, and the rules of money in politics were unrecognizable. So the story of sort of the rise of populists like Trump is obviously a complicated one. I try to make that clear in the book, but where money comes in essentially is that there have been charismatic populists before. Some of you may remember Pat Buchanan's runs. There were more than one. Buchanan was the Trump of his era. He was good TV. He was funny in a particular kind of not very healthy or normal way. He would literally wave a pitchfork. He was kind of a Trump-like figure, and primary voters loved him. But at the time, the kind of traditional Republican Party leadership, the kind of committeemen and people, donors who had wanted electable candidates who would protect their financial interests above all else, had the kind of campaign spending heft to make people like Pat Buchanan go away. So he sort of disappeared under this tidal wave of money, even though if you were just looking at enthusiasm of primary voters, he may well have pulled off the kind of thing we saw Donald Trump do in 2016. The anti-abortion movement kind of contributed to changes in campaign finance, not just in the sense of more money entering politics, but in the sense of where the money was coming from. So it's increasingly coming from outside groups. So think super PACs, nonprofits. the Republican Party can create super PACs and nonprofits if it wants to, and it does, but the traditional party leadership couldn't control the ones that were launched by others. So there's kind of, through this kind of shift in campaign finance, some of which was intended, some of which was opportunism on the part of the anti-abortion movement, there was a kind of hollowing out of the old GOP leadership. And with it, kind of the taking away of what had been a major tool that electability first Republicans had used to get rid of populists. And that, of course, was to the delight of the anti-abortion movement, which believed that electability first Republicans would never want Roe v. Wade to be overturned, right? They wanted a party that was beholden to the anti-abortion movement, not able to give in to its demands when it suited it and not when it didn't make sense from an electability standpoint. And in some ways, that's where we are, right? I mean, the Republican Party in the states and in Congress would, I think it's fair to say, probably flounder much more than would have been the case in earlier decades without the support of conservative Christians and Christian nationalists and abortion opponents.
Yeah, I think you talk a lot in the book about sort of electability first. And that I think is something that is an issue on the left as well, as we're seeing sort of different flanks of our party. I love how you go into descriptions about sort of the convention fights and the backroom wrangling around that. It's a real sort of fascinating insider view. Can you read a little bit from the book? I always like to hear authors do their own words, and I love the language in your book as well.
Thanks. Yeah, so the Republican hierarchy had long worked to weed out candidates who appeared too far to the right to be electable. For decades, the party establishment had a near monopoly on seasoned campaign staff, the best access to major donors, and connections to reporters who could make a candidate a public name. Denying insurgent candidates these resources could starve their campaigns. In 1992 and 1996, insurgent Pat Buchanan had a devoted following, but the GOP hierarchy stopped him in his tracks. In 2010, when the Tea Party tested the party hierarchy, the pillars of control, especially media access and campaign dollars, had begun to fall away. In 1992 and 1996, when Buchanan ran his most effective campaigns, conservative media began and ended with Rush Limbaugh, and Fox News was just getting started. By 2010, Fox News had been the nation's top cable news network for 9 years running. New conservative radio hosts and online news sites seemed to appear every day. Breitbart, founded in 2007 as an online news aggregator by conservative activist Andrew Breitbart, had seen strong gains since Barack Obama took office. Tucker Carlson, a conservative journalist who had become a Fox News commentator, co-founded another conservative site, The Daily Caller, in 2010. The former journalist Christopher Ruddy had started Newsmax, another online news site with seed money from the Scaife Foundation. In 2010, he launched the online broadcaster Newsmax TV. While the legacy media struggled, conservative outlets thrived. Newsmax reported a $10 million increase in revenue between 2008 and 2009 alone. The party's establishment's stranglehold on election spending was also starting to weaken. Citizens United, in another decision, Speech Now, had opened the door to more spending by super PACs, unions, and corporations. After Speech Now, super PACs became the fastest form of election spending. Whereas individuals could contribute only $5,000 to a regular PAC, which couldn't accept any money from corporations or unions, super PACs could accept unlimited and uncapped contributions from anyone, so long as they only made independent expenditures. That made them extremely attractive to both conservative donors and issue-based groups.
It's always great to hear from a historian or an historian. If I was really going to be one, I would pronounce it right. And I think that reading also just reminds us of this didn't start with Fox and with Trump. And then as I was reading the book, I was like looking back at Rush Limbaugh and how that kind of progression and expansion and now moving to online, but that another thing that really struck me when you were talking about the history was that there were people from progressive groups from the ACLU and others who were also very much aligned on the campaign finance and reform or not reform. Can you talk a little bit about kind of why there were, I guess, both sides of the spectrum supporting these initiatives?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was obviously it was sort of counterintuitive that this would be a cause that the anti-abortion movement would care about, because social conservatives don't have a lot of money. And there were, in fact, prominent social conservatives who didn't want to get involved in the campaign finance fight, like the famous anti-feminist Phyllis Schlafly, who some people are familiar with from, Mrs. America, the show about her activism against the ERA. But progressives, I think, especially civil libertarians in the American Civil Liberties Union, believed the argument that that limits on the money spent on political speech were indistinguishable from limits on political speech. And so if you were opposed to one, you would have to be opposed to the other. The argument for social conservatives, I think, was much more complicated, and it really had to do with influence on the Republican Party. So in the 90s, when the Supreme Court declined an invitation to reverse Roe, even though the court had a conservative supermajority, you began to see abortion opponents saying, well, what did we do wrong? What could we do differently to control the court? And the first answer was essentially, we need more influence over who's nominated for the court. It's not enough to just have Republicans in office, because the temptation is going to be to pick, the John Roberts, the Sandra Day O'Connor, the person who's going to have an easy confirmation. So they thought the way for us to get more money or more influence is to have more money, right? To have more money to help their kinds of Republicans get elected, to have more money to purchase more influence in the party, to have more money to help Republicans make money, to kind of prove to Republicans who are not sure that being opposed to abortion was good politics, that the anti-abortion movement had value. And so entering into campaign finance was a way of sort of shoring up what was not a very, at the time, healthy relationship with the GOP. And that meant convincing other social conservatives to care about this issue who didn't. It meant even making the GOP consistent on campaign finance, which it really wasn't at the time. There was a lot of sort of, I'm for a campaign finance reform that is bad for Democrats, So they were not sort of opposed to it in principle in the way they would become later. So there's this big coalition opposed to campaign finance reform. And I was surprised both by how bipartisan it was in some ways, but also by how much of a role social conservatives who didn't in obvious ways stand to gain from more money in politics saw the value of that and really ran with it.
And you do talk a lot about in the book about the splinters between the different factions of the pro-life movement, that there's the kind of Operation Rescue end of people who are blockading and clinic violence, and Phyllis Schlafly's group, as well as those who would sort of be more purist around a human life amendment. And I found that fascinating because I think we always assume that, there's sort of Republicans and anti-abortion groups are very well disciplined and maintained and in a kumbaya way, and that the left is not as much. But tell us a little bit about some of the fractures that you talk about in the book, and how, the human life amendment versus the sort of disputes over partial birth abortion and those kinds of things that you discuss the history of in the book.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's impressive, I think, so one thing to be clear about the anti-abortion movement is that there's some unanimity, right? So if you ask people in the anti-abortion movement, almost to a person, they will say the point was not to reverse Roe v. Wade. The point was to get some kind of national recognition of personhood, which in practical terms would mean a nationwide ban. That could be through a Supreme Court decision recognizing personhood. It could be through a federal constitutional amendment. So Julie was referring to a human life amendment, which would have been a kind of constitutional amendment saying the word person in the Constitution refers to, life before and after birth, and that therefore abortion is unconstitutional effectively. So the people who were involved in campaign finance had lots of critics. One, because they were willing to be more pragmatic in the short term, right? To kind of believe that half a loaf is better than none, that limiting access to abortion is better than going for kind of a perfect law that doesn't pass. They were also accused by many in the anti-abortion movement of doing something that was a distraction. So for example, the National Right to Life Committee, which is the largest national anti-abortion group, still to this day will not designate a member of Congress as pro-life unless they're opposed to campaign finance, right? That's factored into whether they're viewed as pro-life or not. There were many, like Phyllis Schlafly, who said that's insane. We don't have that many politicians who support us. And if we have someone who supports us on abortion, but not on campaign finance, why are we saying they can't be our friend anymore? How is this even helping us? We don't have enough resources and time to ban abortion or convince people that they should ban abortion. And we're using what time and money we have to do things that are going to help the Koch brothers and maybe the GOP donor class, but how does this help us? So there were always really profound strategy disagreements, at the same time that there was a lot of unanimity about what the goal was, which I think is confusing to people, because occasionally I'll see people, including reporters, say there's the moderate wing of the movement that's in favor of incremental restrictions and the kind of extremist movement that wants personhood. The entire movement wants personhood, right? It was a question of what should you do in the short term if you can't get personhood? What's the best way to get personhood? But that still created these really deep strategy fractures. And frankly, I mean, they're even deeper now than in the period I was writing about in the book.
Good. No, sorry. So, and people should know that they can put questions in the Q&A function, and we will get to those in the latter part of our discussion. But let me ask you on that note, what now that the dog has caught the car, as they say, and Roe has been overturned, what do you see as next around the Human Life Amendment? Is that something that you think that you just noted that they're more sort of disorganized is a strong word, but there is less uniformity than before. Do you have any sense of what the different goals are now for the anti-abortion movement?
Yeah, no one is talking about the Human Life Amendment because I think people on the right finally woke up to the fact that it's really hard to amend the Constitution, which you would think would have been the lesson from the Equal Rights Amendment, right? So I think there's also an almost, I think, childlike faith in this conservative Supreme Court, right? That maybe this court will give them personhood. And I think there's also an awareness that the court is probably more likely to do that than the political processes, right? Getting a supermajority of states or a supermajority in Congress to ban all abortions all over the country is just like, that's not going to happen. So I think the court is one focal point. The other thing that we've seen, I think, is as the movement over time has become more and more focused on and strongest in the American South, there's been more of a focus on punishment, right? On sort of not so much on what personhood could mean in terms of, you have to pay child support to people who are pregnant and you have to let them drive in the HOV lane and you have to, expand welfare protections before, like, that's not where the energy is. For the most part, the energy is in the direction of sort of punishing doctors and punishing a kind of ever expanding class of folks who are deemed to aid or abet. There are disagreements, I think, there are disagreements about the extent to which the movement should try to punish doctors and people who contribute to abortion funds and other people in progressive states who are doing things that are legal in those states, if they're doing them to help people from states where abortion is illegal. One or maybe even multiple factions are of the opinion that the movement should use SB 8, so the kind of Texas style anybody can sue people idea, to effectively either prevent travel or extend state criminal laws outside of the borders of those states. There are other people in the movement who think that that's either going to be politically disastrous or ineffective. There's another approach that says the movement needs to be very aggressive in terms of policing the sort of boundary, basically policing information, which is something Julie knows a lot about, but essentially defining aiding and abetting so expansively that it's hard, for example, to even host, much less provide content to a website about how to have a self-managed abortion or how to donate to an abortion fund or how to be being an abortion doula, referrals, any of that would be considered criminal. So that's a different strategy. And there's a lot of ambiguity about how hard to go after corporations. Whether, for example, some lawmakers in Texas say they want to individually prosecute CEOs that reimburse. So, and there's a major debate now about whether to punish women and pregnant people, which is, I think, it's not unprecedented exactly, because there were people in the movement who wanted to do that before, but they were not in a position to make any kind of difference in any kind of legislature. I think they're still a minority, but they're a growing minority, particularly within the Southern Baptist Convention, which passed a resolution in 2021 that picks up on some of the arguments that people use to justify punishing women. These folks often refer to themselves as abolitionists, so they're on the rise, and that's another fault line. But there's no kind of one group running the show, which means if we're trying to predict which of these approaches will prevail, the answer may be all of them, but it may also be that we just don't know for a year or two.
I mean, it's interesting you say there isn't one group running the show, and I think this goes back to the kind of level of chaos that we're seeing and that we're really seeing on the ground. I know there was a group of Texas legislators that wrote a very, I think, threatening letter to a Texas-based law firm accusing them of having broken criminal law and possibly civil law by funding employees to travel. And it's having an enormously chilling effect. I mean, whether or not the letter itself, I don't know, but the overall chaos, the uncertainty. I know Planned Parenthood of Montana is not treating women and people traveling from out of state. So it's interesting that even in the chaos, they've kind of achieved a self-censoring, at least, or a pause for the moment in the abortion rights space as well. And that alone is I think kind of concerning, especially when you're talking about criminal charges and the disparate impact on people of color in this country, that there are, some people have more to fear than others.
Oh yeah, especially with this kind of carceral turn, right? Because we have a pretty strong sense of what happens when you start having discretion placed in the hands of law enforcement.
Right. And some of the accusations alone, and I think the huffing and puffing coming out of the South in particular is really having an unfair effect. And it's hard to tell people to go forward and take risks, but we know that people who need abortions will continue to take the risk. So I guess the question is sort of turning to the court piece of it. You're thankfully not optimistic that the court is going to hand them fetal personhood. I will grab onto that, but I also never thought we would be where we are. And certainly the anti-abortion movement in the Christian conservative piece of it is very closely aligned with anti-LGBTQ initiatives, sort of very traditional gender stereotype view of family life. How do you see, I guess, the connection of, is that where we're heading next? Is contraception in the crosshairs? Is marriage equality in the crosshairs? What do you, from your sense of the anti-abortion movement, think will be kind of the next move with the court?
Yeah, I mean, I think contraception's already on the table, because one of the things that's pretty clear from the debate about the Affordable Care Act, and some of the people in the book were centrally involved in this, is that the meaning of contraception's always been contested. So it's not so much that I think we'll see a lot of conservative states saying we hereby outlaw contraception. I don't think that will happen quickly. It's more that states that have said they want to ban abortion are defining abortion in ambiguous enough ways that you could sweep in contraceptives, especially because some people who are opposed to abortion believe that, IUDs are abortifacients, believe that, emergency contraceptives are abortifacients. So I think that's where we're likely to see the action on that. There's absolutely going to be, I think, an effort vis-a-vis same-sex marriage or marriage equality. I think there are multiple reasons for that. I mean, it's often the same people. The strategy, I think, that worked in Roe, which was to sort of convince the Supreme Court, or this conservative majority, one, not to care about concerns about legitimacy or popular opinion, two, to convince the court that if the court had, quote unquote, failed to settle a divisive dispute, but in other words, if there's still resistance from conservative states to a Supreme Court ruling, that means that it's somehow failed on its own terms and deserves reconsideration. There's almost kind of a playbook. If you want to challenge a case like Obergefell versus Hodges on marriage equality, you just pass laws saying we're going to ignore it and we're going to restrict access to it, and then go to the Supreme Court and say, look, it's unsettled. Like, what do you want us to do? It clearly needs to be reconsidered. And there's even a campaign finance connection. I think one of the things that is a kind of campaign finance agenda item for anti-abortion groups and social conservatives going forward is as the kind of gutting of disclosure rules. So rules that would prevent even more dark money from flowing into politics. There was a strong sense the anti-abortion movement had, especially when it came to marriage equality, that a lot of donors were very conservative, but living in pretty progressive areas, right? So imagine, the wealthy donor living in New York City or in Los Angeles or in Silicon Valley, who may want to give lots of money to an anti-marriage equality cause, but doesn't want their name attached to that, right? Doesn't want their colleagues, clients, neighbors to know that that's what they're doing. So there's been, I think, a push for greater and greater donor anonymity. And I think we'll continue to see that from the same people who are doing that on the abortion side. There's a push to do that, to make it easier to fund and energize campaigns to undo Obergefell and attack same-sex marriage.
Well, I guess that's sobering. Tell us what you think about sort of what the strategy for moving in the opposite direction is. I mean, when we look at the court right now, we've got a solid 6 justices who are, shall we say, happy to follow a conservative agenda and are very text-based in the Constitution and are fairly young. So what do you think about, is there hope at the Supreme Court? Is there a way of making changes, and where would Democrats or progressives or people who care about these rights be best served at putting their energy, taking a page from the playbook that you outline that the anti-abortion movement did so successfully over the decades?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at things the anti-abortion movement did successfully, I think obviously there are things that progressives could do in terms of making the courts more of an issue. I think there wasn't particularly effective messaging to regular voters to care about the Supreme Court on the left as much as there was on the right. There are plenty of people on the right who don't really know much about courts, who really care about control of the Supreme Court. And I don't know if that's true as much on the left. But I think in terms of stuff that can be done now, a lot of it is at the state and local level. If you think about who enforces laws, or like how much in the way of investigatory resources or prosecutorial resources are going to be invested in punishing people for abortion, especially if people are performing those abortions in states where it's legal, that's going to depend on who local prosecutors are, who local sheriffs are. Whether states go very far in having these laws will depend on who's in governor's mansions, who's in state legislatures. And I think, Ireland, where Julie's done a lot of work, would also suggest that, the right kind of direct democracy can be powerful too, as a place for progressives to invest their energy. I think that's especially true because we have pretty good polling data in a variety of conservative states that would suggest that, one, there's strong preferences for Republicans in a lot of these states. And two, that there's also strong uncertainty that they want an abortion ban, right? So Oklahoma, for example, the best data we have would suggest that something like 51% of people don't want an abortion ban. And yet we have Governor Stitt signing quite literally any abortion ban that crosses his desk. We have something like, a pretty sizable majority in Florida, a state that has a Republican governor and Republican legislature. We have similar stories in parts of the Midwest, lots of parts of the South, not everywhere, but lots of places. And so I think that's another potentially promising strategy, to be able to go to voters and say what you think about abortion access and reproductive rights and justice. You can disaggregate from what you think about partisanship. So you can have Republicans and still not criminalize all abortions in your state. And I think that that's another a particularly powerful place for storytelling, because if it's local, if it's about what happens when abortion is banned in your community, not kind of abstraction, that can be powerful and can maybe move beyond part of the problem, which I think is that anti-abortion groups have been good at capturing the courts and good at capturing political parties. And the more this goes down to the local level, the more, one, you probably have less polarization, because the law would reflect what people like, even if it doesn't ultimately reflect what people who are pro-choice want. But also it would break this kind of partisan hold that's been on people who might not like abortion bans in their states.
Well, let's go back a minute and then turn to sort of how partisan things are and how that happened. But I think going back to this question, I think what you said about sort of we don't have to turn every red state blue is fairly radical when we have a very partisan and two-party system in this country right now. And so a friend of mine dug up her Iowa grandmother's buttons that were Republicans for choice, and they're an artifact at this point. And I think the question is, how do we move when the parties in the Democratic and Republican parties have everything so locked up? How do we move towards changing and the kind of partisan split, getting more Republicans to care about the abortion issue, and frankly, getting more Democrats willing to go into states where we're not going to flip from red to blue, but we are going to expand abortion rights, at least as a first step. And do you think that's possible, or do the parties have such a lock on everything from staffing to donors lists to email addresses that it's going to be a hard shift to make?
I mean, I think it'll be hard, but I think the fact that everyone has to focus on the states now and the local level will help, because And I think there are also several direct democracy things happening right now, right? So there's some sort of very blue states like California and Vermont that are actually going to put the word abortion in their constitutions. That's being voted on right now. There's measures in both Kansas where Republicans are trying to say there is no right to abortion in the state constitution, contrary to what the state Supreme Court held. And Michigan, where there's some ambiguity about what the state constitution means in Michigan, but where there's an effort to say, clearly, we in Michigan as voters think there is a right to abortion in the Constitution. So I think if those things work, there's already a lot of energy and support around them. But I think if those efforts work, we'll see more people say, okay, you know, it's worth it to take the time to go to the local level, because this sort of federal fixes like are not happening soon, right? We're not having, the Women's Health Protection Act is not passing right away. The Supreme Court is not changing right away. And I mean, for what it's worth, right, as someone who studies the history of this, in order for those things to happen, progressives need to be as committed to this fight as conservatives were for the past half century. And I'm not saying that shouldn't be done, but I think in the meantime, there's a reason to kind of get literate about and involved in local struggles that aren't as glamorous as the national ones we're more familiar with. And I think if some of these state constitutional efforts bear fruit, like Michigan, I think is particularly a bellwether, you'll see maybe more efforts to take this issue directly to voters, and also lessons learned about how to do it. Like Kansas is a little bit of a cautionary tale potentially, because Republicans are putting Kansas's initiative measure on the ballot during a primary when turnout is usually low and usually slants pretty partisan. So, you know, there may be kind of lessons learned about best practices that we might be able to take forward if we're trying to get, you know, take the temperature of voters who want.
Yeah, so when you say take it directly to voters, you mean as a ballot initiative?
Exactly, right. So and importantly, like disaggregating it from partisanship, because I don't think it's very likely we're to see Republicans moving very far away from, if anything, I mean, I think the dynamics in the Republican Party now are probably be moving toward more sweeping positions on abortion in a lot of these states because they're politically uncompetitive, right? So they're only worried about
the ballot initiatives. I mean, it makes me pause because they are so expensive, and you know, I haven't really thought about them. Like, well, what if it's in a state where there's an abortion ban and you're using it to liberalize? Historically, they have been used to restrict abortion access. Right. In Ireland, it was great, but I also pause because this kind of idea of voting on something that's a human right. But at this point, I'll take it wherever it can work. I mean, I think you're right. It's a state by state different strategy. And I want to just echo your call for people to get involved in the electoral and voting piece, both in their own blue state. I mean, in New York, where, you know, Governor Hochul has done some tremendous steps to expand sort of the abortion access in New York State to people traveling, as well as protecting healthcare providers, as well as offering funds. There are plenty of other states that can still use our sort of virtual campaigning or our door-to-door and our dollars and things.
Yeah, and state Supreme Court's races too, because I mean, I think people don't often realize, but like state Supreme Court judges who are deciding whether their state constitutional rights to abortion, those folks are often elected or subject to merit retention elections. So that's another area to kind of find out where your state judges are, to use your time and energy to help in other races like that. I think that's really important too.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that's interesting as we're watching the Center for Reproductive Rights, the ACLU, and others challenge some of these so-called trigger bans, which are laws that popped into effect as soon as Roe versus Wade was overturned, challenging them on state constitutional grounds, which may provide more liberal provisions. But as Mary, as you noticed, you know, even in Florida, Governor DeSantis has, I think, appointed 3 of the states just
I think it may be 4 now, but yeah, it's a lot.
And you know, I mean, I don't know what you think of. Also, when the Supreme Court, in so sort of eviscerating 50 years of constitutionally protected rights, are they setting a really bad example for these state court judges to do the same thing? I mean, it's
and we're already seeing that. I mean, like Iowa's Supreme Court, the composition of the court changed and they reversed a state constitutional decision recognizing strong abortion rights from 2018, right? I mean, so this is, and I think that's obviously the point with state Supreme Courts, that state constitutional law isn't a panacea, but that state courts are political creatures in a way that the US Supreme Court is not. I don't mean they're more political. I mean, there's a little bit more accountability, right? So usually they can lose elections, right? And that's happened before. Like we've seen in conservative states, when states for courts recognize marriage equality, for example, there were successful campaigns sometimes to remove them. So I think that's an area that progressives have kind of not paid a lot of attention to. Retention elections for a lot of state Supreme Courts are just a snooze, like everybody gets retained. And that's, so I mean, I'm with you, Julie, that the Florida Supreme Court is like 100% going to say there's no state constitutional right to abortion, and they're 100% going to uphold anything that comes.
I'm always more delusional than that. I'm like, well, maybe they might, but yeah, I know that.
But I mean, they may not get retained. That's more what I'm saying. Like they'll be up. I mean, some of them I don't remember enough, but some of them probably are already up for merit retention, and others will be.
Right. And I think in New York, they're appointed by the governor. So again, it's the state races really matter as well. I know right. Governor Hochul's going to have a chance to appoint somebody soon too. Because in Park Slope, you can walk around and see signs in people's windows that say expand the court. I just want to loop back to the US Supreme Court. If you think there's any, is that something we should be focused on as well, of calling for any kind of court reform, or is that just, an idea that may have worked in FDR's time to threaten, but is not the way to go with this, and just ride it out with the Supreme Court?
I mean, I've always been, I'm supportive of court reform. I don't know. I worry a little bit about court reform, not court reform in general, but expanding the court, simply because I don't know where that stops. I've always been, though I think it's more complicated constitutionally, very strongly supportive of term limits, because I think there's something really disturbing about the idea that, there's no connection between the fact that Clarence Thomas was put on the court in 1991 when I was in elementary school, and what the American people think the Constitution means today. So even if you believe, as I do, that the Supreme Court is a partisan institution, you can kind of make the argument that, well, okay, maybe when people vote for president or vote for the Senate, they're kind of voting for what kind of Supreme Court they want. But that can't be true like 30 or 40 years after the fact, right? That's the dead hand of the law. So I think, if members of the court were only there for like 5 or 10 years, that would be better. If there were like 5 Republicans and 5 Democrats who always got to be on the court, that would be better. I don't know if expanding the court just doesn't result in, then Mitch McConnell's like, well, you know what, I'm going to add 100 people to the court, because that's totally what he would do. And then I don't know where that stops, or if that really gets rid of the problem. Because I mean, one of the things I think, some people may wonder, was there polarization on the left in this book? Yes. Were there Democrats who wanted to use super PACs in ways we might not love? Totally. But the polarization was asymmetric. So I worry if we expand the court that would continue, right? That somehow court expansion would ultimately lead to a world where there are like 3,000 Clarence Thomases and like 100 people that like Ketanji Brown Jackson. I don't know if that would
broke
happen.
the mold when they made him. There's something happened in his childhood. That can be somebody else's book, but
yeah, I mean, he's in this book a little bit. He and Jim Bopp are, best
well,
friends.
I do want to turn to some of the questions we have, but James Bopp is a character in the book that I think shows that truth is stranger than fiction. He's somebody who I was familiar with when I was litigating at the Center for Reproductive Rights back in the day, who is an attorney and an activist out of Indiana. Tell us a little bit about him, and then why he let you look at his papers and what you thought.
Well, he's one of these people who's, I think, fascinating, because unlike many people in the anti-abortion movement, he's a very religious person. He's very opposed to abortion, but I think his first love really is Republican politics. He told me that one of his first memories, not of politics, but of life, was standing on a corner and watching a parade for Dwight Eisenhower. And when he talks to you about his kind of coming of age, it's not, playing sports and flirting with girls in high school. It's, campaigning for Barry Goldwater. So this was someone who kind of breathes Republican politics. And so I think the idea of turning the GOP into a vehicle for, gun lovers and abortion opponents was sort of his lifelong fantasy, right? Because it was about the machinery of the party. And he's fascinating too, because he seems to be everywhere, right? I mean, he litigated a lot of the anti-vax stuff we've seen recently. He was involved in efforts to overturn the 2020 election. He's involved in ongoing efforts limiting access to, mail balloting. He was also an important figure because he sort of showed how deeply the connections between the anti-abortion movement and the Republican Party run. There's a kind of, I think, a myth that some historians had that essentially the Republicans would say, oh, we'll just say nice things about abortion, but we won't really do anything. At the end of the day, we'll mostly be there to cut taxes and help big businesses. And I think that story is not completely wrong, but it massively understates the close ties that there are between the movement and the party. And I think Bob really embodies that. In terms of why he gave me his papers, it's a really weird story. So I had interviewed him for other books. And one day he called me out of the blue and he said, I have a file on you. He does, like in his archive in the finding aid, there's a file labeled Mary Ziegler where that he regularly updates. He said, I know everything about you. I know what you think, but I think you're a straight shooter and I want someone to write this history. I mean, I don't know what his motives were, but then he helped me get to know other people. And I've actually on my own been able to get to know other conservatives, which makes me wonder, like on the one hand, it's great. On the other hand, I'm always like, maybe I'm saying something wrong. Like if people like this are like, you're great, this is amazing. I'm like, ooh, I don't know. But I think there's
as a reader of your book, I can say it was very, very well done with the tone and the insight without, yes. I mean, I wouldn't have wanted to read a book about the anti-abortion movement by somebody who was in line with them because you can't trust it. I trust you. And James,
I think maybe it's unfair, basically. I think that was where it was coming from. And I think philosophically, and I've had disagreements with some folks, Linda Greenhouse and I have had interesting conversations about this, but I think that if you are talking about something, and I take this very seriously, right? I think this is like the erosion of our democracy. I think it's better to let people like Bob tell you what they think, to use their words and not have me intervene and, like have the narrator come in and say, dun, 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 this is bad. I think it's better to let people see, what these people were doing and see what they were saying and then form their own judgments. I think just as methodologically as a historian, I always think that's more powerful.
Yeah, and it's very, I mean, the tone of your book, it was very nice to read something that was not so partisan inflammatory. I mean, I think it's exhausting for a lot of us to be on edge for, 4+ years and to have this kind of fighting and politics as a blood sport, literally and figuratively. So I really appreciated that. So James, Bob, and I agree on one thing in life.
There you go. Now we can all get along.
So I want to turn to some of the questions in the Q&A. And this one I think you kind of touched upon a bit, but maybe just spell out a little bit more about how the anti-abortion movement kind of really connects the moral religious issue and this kind of big money piece. What is the big money piece in aligning with outlawing abortion?
Well, I think that it really came into play because Republicans historically were not convinced that overruling Roe or banning abortion was a good idea politically. They've seen a lot of the same polls the rest of us have. And so there was a sense that people in the anti-abortion movement needed another reason for the Republican, another value proposition for the Republican Party in effect. And that value proposition became campaign finance, right? That people like Bob were the masters of finding ways around campaign finance limits, that anti-abortion groups would become major donors, and that anti-abortion groups would bring crucial cases to the Supreme Court that would help deregulate campaign spending. And that on the other side, the anti-abortion movement would help to lobby other social conservatives, like who are more focused on issues like LGBTIQ rights, to care about campaign finance too, which was not by any means inevitable. So that was a way of gaining more influence in the Republican Party to make sure that the kind of judge who would overturn Roe, right, someone who was much more ideologically pure, someone who was much less indifferent to the courts, much more indifferent rather to the court's reputation, that those would be the people on the bench when the time came to overrule Roe. And I think that, that worked up to a point.
Right. And that I think really comes through when you look at sort of Sandra Day O'Connor and then some of the candidates that, the Robert Bork's, the Borking a nomination that came out of that, moving all the way through sort of Harriet Miers. I mean, it was a real, time travel of recent history that got us to Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett and the development of the court that we have today. Somebody asked a question about contraception, and people who are pro-life strongly oppose contraception, and I guess asking from that point, how do they justify such a self-contradictory position? And then I think the other piece of that of what happens now, are we going to see Republicans that are going to be less in line with the anti-abortion and maybe not wanting to go as far as outlawing contraception or reformulating it as an abortifacient?
Yeah, I think there's definitely concern about that. There's concern about that, I think, even from the larger anti-abortion groups, right? I mean, you'll see groups like the Susan B. Anthony list saying like, hey, we're not going to take your IVF and we're not coming for your birth control, because I think they think that at a certain point there's going to be more of a backlash. The problem, I think, from the standpoint of people who care about contraception access is that state legislators don't care about the national anti-abortion movement anymore, right? Like they don't rely on them to get reelected. They worry about primary voters. That's the concern. They worry about someone from the right saying you're weak on abortion because you're not trying to ban emergency contraceptives. So that's where I think the uncertainty lies. There are people in the anti-abortion movement who do support contraceptive access. They're not, well, actually, that's not probably a very accurate way to put it. There are people who are opposed to abortion who support contraceptive access. There's a distinction between that and the anti-abortion movement. I think the way that people in the movement try to square it is by saying that this is not actually contraception at all, it's abortion, and that they support what they would consider like natural family planning, which would be, you don't have sex when a person who can get pregnant is ovulating, or you withdraw during sex or something. That they would say they're not opposed to all.
And for those of our listeners, I think we should say those methods are not very reliable.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So I mean, right. I mean, as a disclaimer, but that would be, I think that would be how they would try to do it. It's one of, I think, the artifacts of the anti-abortion movement being so wedded to the GOP, because in the 70s, you had some anti-abortion groups saying, sure, let's be for contraception. Like, why not? That's fine. And that became, because I think aligning with the GOP meant aligning with groups that were more consistently socially conservative about sex than some in the anti-abortion movement. Though most were always socially conservative about sex, there were outliers who were kind of pushed to the margins because they didn't fit in the new Republican Party.
Well, and look, I imagine that there are many in the Republican Party, and maybe most of them live in Connecticut, but that would like to see some reining in and some more moderate positions. I mean, I know there are a lot of Republicans who don't feel at home in their own party. Is there kind of a way forward around campaign finance is the genie out of the bottle and we're not going back? Or what do you think is the way forward, both for Democrats and Republicans, as far as financing of elections? Is there a model you've seen in another country or even a state that works? Because your book makes it clear we've pivoted left and right, not politically, but that there's been some reform and changes, and it just we're still in a mess of money in politics.
I mean, I think strengthening disclosure rules is obviously a good idea. I think if we really are serious about money as speech, people should be comfortable putting their name on the speech, right? I mean, I think that, and that also, I think, checks people fueling more extremist groups, because they're often unwilling to, if they have to be transparent about it. Otherwise, it's really ambiguous, right? So some people are big fans of sort of lots of small dollar donations. They point to the prevalence of those during the, especially the first nomination of Barack Obama. It's complicated though, because I think another person who's done really well with small dollar donors is Marjorie Taylor Greene, right? So I think there's a mixed bag there. I think the same is true of, some people have suggested that parties need to be able to raise and spend more money. So like soft money, some of the reforms that we've already had should be withdrawn so the parties can go back to their traditional role of having more influence. I'm not sure that would work either. So I think probably the clearest, and that may be just beyond my ken, but I think that the clearest thing I think is that there needs to be more disclosure, not less, so that people who are willing to put their money behind a message are only willing to do that when they actually want people to know what the message is and what their role in supporting it is.
And do you think there's any role for public funding or financing, anything like that, or anything that would?
Yeah, I mean, I think that would be helpful. I don't know if that, I mean, I think that's more just, I don't think that's going to happen soon, but I think that that's been, and I think there's also, obviously, if we did have public financing, again, as we do in some states and as we did in federal elections at one point, we'd have to learn from, learn from past experience, in the sense that there were very quickly people found ways of circumventing the public financing system and raising and spending tons of money outside of it. So we would need to probably redesign the system at the federal level to prevent that from happening.
And then we've had a real history of self-funded campaigns, both in New York City with the mayor, and then the president who sold stake and real estate and who knows what else to make his own funding. So, and any hope for a multi-party system that you see in this country ever? And would that sort of have less fierce partisanship than we've seen, I think, play out through this issue and others?
I mean, maybe. That's an interesting point. I haven't thought of the extent to which the two-party system leads to more polarization of the abortion issue. It seems difficult because there's so much, I mean, and we've seen this anytime there are meaningful third-party candidates, everyone essentially says, and in fact, it can be true that if you do vote for a third-party candidate for president, you may in fact be handing a victory to somebody in the opposite party. So I think there would need to be probably a much broader systemic reform for that to work, because otherwise it can kind of feed into partisanship rather than undermining it. But I think that might help, in part because the two-party system has tended to, especially on the Republican side, reward people who care the most, not reward the largest number of people. Because it's just not true. There's something like 20% of Americans who want all abortions to be criminalized. There's plenty of people.
I want to just underline what you said, is that it has rewarded people who care the most. And I think that's really telling. I always say that abortion has been a very successful wedge issue for the right. And, people who are joining us and listening in tonight, I think, really care, and that we may need to show it a bit more. In some ways, I see that, your book is both about history, but it's also a little bit of a prescription for change as well.
Yeah. And I think it's, I think there's been a tendency on the left to dismiss how sophisticated the right has been on this, but also how committed they've been, right? And so there's definitely something to be learned from that.
Well, I want to end with one more question that came in the chat, and then turn it over to Noah to carry us out. But the question is to continue the earlier conversation around contraception. If the elephant in the room is actually conservative opposition to any sex and sexual pleasure outside the restrictions and strictures imposed by religion, which I think is kind of the question about the values piece and religion in this country. And you talk a lot in the book about the way that the Affordable Care Act was seen almost as an attack on religion. And can you talk about how does what I do or you do or anybody does in their own private life, how does that get construed as such an attack on other people's values?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say. I think that there is a very different idea of equality that resonates with people in the anti-abortion movement. It's one. So I think often when we think of discrimination and equal treatment, we think of groups that have a history of being oppressed in this country, right? Like people of color, like women, like LGBTIQ folks. And many people in the anti-abortion movement joined because their vision of equality was biology, right? That the fetus is oppressed because the fetus is dependent on its mother, or the fetus hasn't been born, that's really what we need to think about when we think about equality, which is a vision of equality, of course, that could be, that doesn't mean you get more concern from discrimination if you have been part of a historically oppressed group. And I think that was part of the messaging. And part of the messaging was also, there was always a way to talk about sex without talking about sex, which was, I think, very powerful. And you see it come up, right? So, I mean, the most powerful way now is essentially when you hear people talking about rape and incest exceptions, or life of the pregnant person or mother exceptions. And essentially the refrain you hear from anti-abortion people generally is that people are going to lie, right? People are going to lie that their lives are at risk. People are going to lie that they've been sexually assaulted. Like, this isn't really a problem because we can't actually trust, basically we can't trust women. That's kind of what and I mean, I don't say that, they don't always say that, but I think in this area, that's part of what's going on. And I think there is an undercurrent, though I don't think it's always visible, and maybe not everyone in the movement believes it, that people who have sex accept the consequences, right? That if women don't want to get pregnant, and if other people who likes trans people and questioning people who don't want to get pregnant, they should just not have sex. The more sophisticated players in the movement wouldn't say that, but I think there's an undercurrent of that in a lot of what they believe. And you tend to see it bubble up to the surface when they're talking, especially about exceptions to bans.
Well, I'm going to turn it over to Noah, but I want to be the first to say thank you for such an interesting conversation and a new take on this issue that just hasn't been given the kind of exposure that you've brought, for which I'm very grateful.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for this. It's been great.
Yeah, thank you both. I'm very grateful as well to both of you for a really insightful conversation and for all of the work that you do. Mary, congratulations again on your book. And those of you at home, please consider purchasing a copy of Dollars for Life from Community Bookstore and or contributing to your local or national abortion fund.
I have one too.
I'm holding it up because Mary isn't. So
yeah, I can hold it up so you don't have to, but it's gonna blur.
We've got it in the shop. We've got it on our website. So come visit us either way. And we hope to see you at another virtual event really soon. Thanks again, both of you. Have a great evening, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Take care.